So welcome to the session, What is Equitable Enforcement? I'm Ken McLeod, I'm the Policy Director for the League of American Bicyclists. We have a great panel here today. We have Farhang Heydari, who is the Legal Director of the Policing Project at NYU School of Law, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to partner with communities and police to promote public safety through transparency, equity, and democratic engagement. We have Shanelle Johnson, Senior Policy Counsel at the Fine and Fiends Justice Center. She is principally responsible for tracking, evaluating, developing policy and best practices for Fine and Fiends Justice Center. She works on national campaigns, model bill language, and comments on state and federal bills. And we have Jenny O'Connell, Senior Program Manager for Safety at NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials. Jenny manages NACTO's road safety and Vision Zero work. Jenny's work at NACTO focused primarily on speed management, including the development of city limits, the first ever tool that places street safety as the topmost priority for setting speed limits in urban areas. We're going to have 3 presentations and then hopefully a little bit of time for questions at the end. And we're going to start with Farhang. So hopefully he is going to be allowed to share his screen and do a short presentation for us now. Let me know.
I actually don't need to share my screen. Can you hear me okay, Ken?
I can.
You can? Okay, great. I don't even have to share my screen. You're just going to see me. So that's even easier.
Excellent.
So I'm coming through okay?
Yeah.
So thank you, Ken, for the introduction. I'm psyched to be virtually attending. Bicycling is a big part of my life. I'm a daily commuter on the bike in New York City here using our bike share system. I've logged several thousand miles on the bike. And so bike safety is always top of my mind. And so I've been kind of sitting in on some of the panels in other sessions, and this has just been really fascinating. But you didn't bring me here to hear about my biking. Instead, you brought me here in my capacity as legal director of the Policing Project. A significant part of my work at the Policing Project focuses on police traffic enforcement, and in particular, the ways that police traffic enforcement can contribute to the types of policing that actually detract from community safety. So that's what I'm going to focus my brief remarks on, and I have a timer, so I will be brief. First, let me take a step back, and I'm going to tell you about the Policing Project. As Ken said, we're a nonprofit attached to NYU. We partner with communities, policymakers, police to bring accountability to policing. And when we say accountability, we mean democratic accountability. And that's simply, in a democratic society, people should have a voice in how they're policed. And this is particularly, in our view, is true for communities of color that bear the brunt of policing in this country. We think traffic enforcement is one area where we're really falling down on the job. So as you all know, and people have talked about, and I don't need to rehash, we're facing a safety crisis on our roads today. This is true for people in cars, on bikes, pedestrians. Communities are experiencing death and crash rates that they haven't seen for decades. Now, for a long time, safety advocates have made traffic enforcement a centerpiece of safety campaigns. And you've seen that from bike and pedestrian safety advocates as well. I remember just a few years ago here in New York City, enforcement becoming a big piece of it. I want to talk to you about the costs and the risks of police enforcement. And the goal here is not to say that there is no role for police enforcement of traffic laws, but that as you are advocating for new safety programming in your communities, that you be really thoughtful about the role of police enforcement. So the first point that I want to talk about, and is really the place that I think every discussion about equitable traffic enforcement has to start, is that that study after study has demonstrated that traffic enforcement disproportionately impacts drivers of color, Black drivers, Hispanic drivers, Indigenous drivers. There's really no dispute about this anymore. There have been communities have known this for decades, but there have been studies since the 90s across the country that demonstrate huge disparities in the rates that Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous drivers are stopped There are studies that show that at nighttime, when it's harder to perceive someone's race, those disparities go down. There are studies that show that Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous drivers are searched more often after they are stopped. There are studies that show that even though they're searched more often, police find evidence of crime less often on Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous drivers. There's evidence that Black drivers are killed more frequently in stops and have force used against them more often. There's evidence of racial disparities in fines and fees that result in stops. And I'm not going to talk about that because Shanelle is really the expert on that. So that's just my point being, in a nutshell, if you are advocating for more enforcement, know that the impacts are not going to fall on your community evenly. It hasn't happened yet in a place that I've seen. Okay, the second point that I want to make for you all, when you're thinking about the role of enforcement in safety, a major driver of the way traffic stops look today in our communities is that the traffic stop is seen by many in law enforcement as not just a traffic safety tactic, but also as a crime fighting tool. Police around the country use tactics known as a pretextual or investigatory stop. And by this, I mean, a stop is initiated for a valid traffic violation, but where the officer's real motive here is not the traffic violation, but to investigate some sort of potential criminal activity. Now, the Supreme Court has told us that there's nothing legally wrong with this tactic. And because of the ways our traffic laws are written, you can pretty much find any reason to pull someone over. Follow any driver long enough, you will find some reason to make that stop. And for this reason, traffic stops have become a cornerstone of what policing looks like. Now, pretextual or investigatory stops, they bear certain hallmarks that are important to understand. So often they're initiated for reasons that don't really implicate traffic safety. So when you hear people talking about low-level or non-moving violations, expired registration tags, air fresheners hanging from windows, from rearview mirrors, the sorts of things that may have some relevance, but aren't the sort of really risky driving behavior that we care about. There are studies that show that Black, Hispanic, Indigenous drivers are pulled over more frequently for those non-moving violations. And when police use traffic stops as a crime fighting tool, they tend not to go to the locations that are really traffic safety problems, where we see major traffic safety corridors, but instead they go to locations that are crime hotspots. And so what you get is officers making stops, asking probing questions, asking for consent to search people's vehicles, running people's names for open warrants, all kinds of policing tactics that get at criminal activity and not traffic safety. This type of tactic erodes trust, right? This is where you get the phrases, driving while Black. This is where you get communities and cities where young Black men know that they're going to be pulled over on a weekly, monthly basis. It becomes a rite of passage in lots of communities. We also know from study after study, including Nashville and Fayetteville, North Carolina, that this type of policing tactic doesn't drive down crime on any kind of citywide level. In fact, in Fayetteville, when they cut back on their use of low-level traffic stops, crime actually began to fall because police were able to focus their resources on more important issues. So what should your takeaway be? What should we actually do with all this information? First and foremost, the answer to traffic safety is not relying on police enforcement to do most of the work. Jenny is going to talk a lot about infrastructure and the importance of those kind of changes. And so that's where I think you're going to get the most bang for your buck. The second takeaway is that we need to care when we advocate for traffic enforcement. We really need to pay attention to what enforcement looks like. That includes, are we issuing fines and fees? Shanelle will talk about that. Are we asking police to enforce lots of low-level warrants, right? Are low-level traffic stops leading to people getting arrested because they missed a court date? And the third takeaway is that safety advocates writ large, whether it's people who care about crime, whether it's people who care about bike safety, need to advocate for sharply limiting police use of pretextual and low-level traffic stops. At the Policing Project, we have model bill, and we're working with communities around the country to focus police attention away from using pretextual and low-level traffic stops and focus on the kinds of relationship building and really dangerous driving activities that actually keep communities safe. I'm actually going to stop right there because I want to hear from everybody else. Happy to answer questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Farhang. It's been great to work with you through the Transportation Equity Caucus and many of the organizations that signed the letter opposing the data-driven approaches to crime and traffic safety program that is sponsored by the Department of Justice and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which is exactly that, using of pretextual stops and looking to do crime and traffic safety at the same time. We really need to focus on traffic safety if we're doing things for traffic safety. And we hear that from all sorts of organizations, including ones like the Governor's Highway Safety Association. So hopefully people will get in the chat with some questions, but excited to hand it off to Shanelle. Hopefully you have the opportunity to share your screen if you have slides, or if you don't have slides, you can just talk.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, I also don't have slides, so I'll just be talking. So first of all, good afternoon, everyone. We're happy to be here, happy to be able to participate on this panel. Again, I'm from the Fines and Fees Justice Center. If you guys aren't familiar with our organization, we work with impacted communities and justice system stakeholders, primarily to eliminate fees in the justice system and ensure that fines are equitably imposed and enforced. So with that, you may be wondering, why are we here? What is our role in this particular conversation? But just to put it simply, we want safe streets just as much as you do, but we want to make sure that it's done in a safe and equitable way, which I know is something that's also important to all of you. So my goal for today is just to have a brief conversation about why enforcement, again, may not be the best way to do that, and how it might not be making our streets safer in the long run. You know, when we hear people talk about improving traffic safety, particularly our local political leaders, we often hear them talk about enforcement, either through the use of police or through automatic traffic enforcement. And they sort of hold that up as the best way to ensure public traffic safety. And while enforcement can make some difference, it does come with its own set of harms. So today I really want to highlight some of those harms so that you all have the full scope of what's happening and what's possible. Also, just want to highlight that traffic safety approaches that prioritize enforcement, they're easy and they're lucrative. So when they are pitched as a solution, it's not always because they're the best way to create traffic safety, it's because they're easy and they're lucrative. So jumping right into it, what are fines and fees? Fines are monetary sanctions that are imposed as punishment for violating the law, and fees are costs, assessments, and surcharges imposed to access services or to fund the justice system or some other government services. Historically, we saw an increase in the assessment of fines and fees in the 1980s, and then again after the recession in 2008, where jurisdictions responded to budget deficits by increasing both the number and the amount of fines and fees that were assessed, as well as their reliance on fines and fees as a source of revenue. So some examples of jurisdictions that have heavily relied on fines and fees. One is Ferguson, Missouri. In 2015, the Department of Justice found that the city planned to collect 23% of its revenue through fines and fees, and also that police engaged in racially discriminatory policing in order to increase that revenue through fines and fees. Brookside, Alabama is a more recent example. In 2020, over 49% of the town's revenue came from fines and fees. Chicago and DC are also examples of cities that rely on enforcement to generate revenue from fines and fees, particularly DC, where there are currently 140 traffic enforcement cameras. Just last week, the mayor approved an additional 342 cameras. So this is all in a city with a total area of only 68 square miles. So fines and fees, they are harmful, but especially so for low-income communities and communities of color. When people can't pay, some of the consequences include assessing more cost, driver's license suspensions, and the loss of the right to vote. Even more harmful is the fact that in 14 states, they also criminalize low-level traffic offenses, which means that a warrant can be issued and you can be arrested for a traffic offense. For example, in Nevada, before they decriminalized traffic offenses, 83% of their open bench warrants were for traffic fines. And of course, those warrants for non-payment were issued disproportionately against low-income people and people of color. So yeah, as I mentioned, there has been momentum around the use of enforcement, specifically ATE, as a solution to address both the rise in traffic and pedestrian fatalities and injuries, as well as to limit violent encounters between police and officers. But what do we mean when we say ATE? So ATE stands for Automated Traffic Enforcement, and it really refers to a wide range of technologies that includes stop sign cameras, automated license plate readers, school bus stop cameras, but the most common, the ones that people are mostly familiar with, are red light cameras and speed cameras. All of this technology that falls under ATE, it's all different, and they all have their own pros and cons, but practically all of them include some type of financial sanction as their primary enforcement mechanism. As far as effectiveness of automated traffic enforcement in creating or improving traffic safety, according to the National Highway Safety Transportation Administration, there are mixed results on the effectiveness of red light cameras. And the administration found that while speed cameras may contribute to some improved safety, they should not be considered as the full answer or the full solution. There's little research on some of those other newer, less common mechanisms that I mentioned. So yes, ATE can be effective in some cases and to some extent, but does it really create the kind of street safety that we want? Research has proven that design and infrastructure and the use of traffic calming measures like speed bumps, driver feedback signs, and roundabouts is the solution, is the thing that will create this type of street safety we want to see. And I know Jenny will talk more about that, but just as an example, in Hoboken, New Jersey, where they're actually prohibited from using automated traffic enforcement, they haven't had a traffic fatality in years. And they rely on things such as daylighting, bike lanes, curb extensions, bus lanes. All these mechanisms don't actually cost more than ATE. They just don't generate the money that ATE does. But the big thing that I really want to spend time today talking to you guys about is really the harms. So ATE should not, where it is used, it should not be implemented without a full consideration of all the harms that it can cause. At the Fines and Fees Justice Center, our focus is on the financial and racial harms that can result from the use of ATE. Conversations and a comprehensive approach should definitely include conversations about privacy, surveillance, data use, all of that. But again, our focus is really on the financial and racial justice impact. So what are the harms? The first one is net widening. ATE doesn't actually replace police enforcement. It's an additional tool that gives you the ability to ticket and cite a larger number of drivers in a shorter period of time. For example, in Washington, D.C., from October 2020 through March 2021, the district issued almost as many tickets as there are residents. And there was just one stop sign or stop sign camera location that brought in more than $1 million in revenue. And again, because of the harmful consequences that people face when they can't pay these tickets, the harms are only increased when more tickets are issued. Another harm is that revenue from ACE is not sustainable as a source of revenue. As I mentioned in the beginning, our justice system's reliance on fines and fees has created this increase in policing for profit, which is essentially the use of policing resources for the purpose of raising revenue through the assessment of fines and fees. And with ATE, that incentive is still there. Even when jurisdictions remove the operations of the cameras from law enforcement to civil enforcement through like transportation departments, the revenue still becomes a part of fiscal planning and budgeting. Also, a number of jurisdictions have allocated revenues from their camera programs to street improvements and investments, which on its face is a good thing, but it creates this catch-22 in which necessary funding for street maintenance and upgrades and improvements is really only sustainable if you can find new ways of issuing violations. Another harm is the technological issues and due process. There have been lots of examples of jurisdictions where drivers have been incorrectly ticketed. In Baltimore a few years ago, they found that they had an error rate of more than 10%, which equated to about 70,000 unjustified tickets. And just last year in Alexandria, Virginia, they were forced to issue refunds for red light camera programming errors. And then on top of the technological concerns is the concern around due process, which is even more heightened in the context of ATE, and the failure to address due process, which is an independent finding that an offense has actually occurred, can result in litigation or the ending of a program altogether, such as in Buffalo, where they recently ended their school speed zone program after it was found that there was no operator to verify the accuracy of the cameras. And the last harm that I want to highlight is the racial disparities. ATE is often thought of as race neutral, but data suggests that that is not in fact the case, and that Black drivers shoulder much of the financial burden. In DC, researchers found that drivers in the district's predominantly Black areas were more than 17 times more likely to receive violations at a cost of 16 times more per resident. And an analysis of cameras in Chicago also found that between 2015 and 2019, about 38% of the tickets during that period went to motorists from majority Black zip codes. So often this disparity is sort of explained away as being due to camera placement. But even when cameras are placed based on crash and safety data, it can still result in racially driven ticketing, as low-income communities and communities of color historically suffer from a lack of investment and design choices that actually contribute to traffic-related deaths and injuries. So the Fines and Fees Justice Center, later this year, we will be releasing policy guidance on ATE and how to implement ATE equitably in light of these harms that I've sort of laid out for you guys here. I think it would be helpful for jurisdictions who have ATE programs that they would like to evaluate, or jurisdictions that are looking to implement or expand their programs. Some of the recommendations include things like consulting with a diverse group of stakeholders, imposing non-monetary sanctions, and prioritizing street design. So if you guys are interested in that, like I said, that should be out later this year. But in closing, I just want to reiterate that a comprehensive approach to street safety really does require us to be thoughtful about whether enforcement is the best way to get the safety that we want, and to be thoughtful about the harms that we are likely to create. So I'll stop there, but thanks.
Enforcement may not be the best approach. It's kind of a lucrative and easy approach. Whereas street design may be the best approach, but is an expensive and too often difficult approach, but one that we really need. So excited to get Jenny O'Connell from NACTO in here, who I believe does have slides and hopefully can present them.
Yes, let me try. No, it says I'm disabled from sharing.
Can you make her a host? Yeah.
Okay, I see that. Okay, so you can see it, right, Ken?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, great. So yes, thank you so much for having me. Sorry I can't be there in DC with those of you who are in person, but glad to be joining you virtually. My name is Jenny O'Connell. I'm a senior manager at NACTO, which is the National Association of City Transportation Officials. I'll talk about who we are in a minute, but Ken gave a nice background on me. I manage our Road Safety and Vision Zero program. And I'm going to be talking about a resource that we developed this year called Breaking the Cycle, which is specifically about bicycling enforcement. So what NACTO is we are a membership association of nearly 100 cities and transit agencies across North America. And we work with our cities in a variety of different ways, but our sort of core work that we do is we work with our cities to develop and support cities as they implement urban street design guidance. And for 2023, our big goal is to update our urban bikeway design guide to create the Urban Bikeway Design Guide 3.0. And at the core of our work on updating the Urban Bikeway Design Guide is a fundamental understanding that really good bike infrastructure begets safety, equity, and sustainability in cities. So in 2022, we embarked on starting this work of developing or updating the Urban Bikeway Design Guide with that core principle at the center of our work. We developed 7 papers to feed into the update that we'll do this year. That included Making Bikes Count, a resource on shared micromobility permitting and regulations, Moving Together, which is about a community collaborative process in bikeway design, Designing for Small Things with Wheels, which is a design resource, Complete Connections, which is about building equitable bike networks, Material Success, which is about what materials to use and when. And one of the resources that we developed is Breaking the Cycle, which is about reevaluating the laws that prevent safe and inclusive biking. And we worked hard with a number of different partners on this, including city staff, but also Bike Walk KC. I saw Amy Scribner on the phone, but Amy Scribner and Michael Kelly, also Charles Brown and Tamika Butler supported as advisors on this paper as well. And what this paper does is it basically identifies commonly enforced biking laws, policies, and rules, and offers recommended practices for how to refocus these laws, rules, and procedures on the safety and well-being of all road users. So I said a minute ago that good infrastructure begets safe, equitable, and sustainable cities. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, on specific communities. So we don't have any really good studies this good on bike infrastructure, but we do know that of the country's 60 most dangerous roads for pedestrians, which are also a road user that's using the road outside of the protection of a motor vehicle, 75% of those roads are in low-income neighborhoods, and more than 50% are in predominantly Black or Latinx neighborhoods. And of the 9 most dangerous corridors that are characterized as urban primary arterials, so those are those big, wide, fast roads, 100% are in majority Black and Latinx neighborhoods. These roads are wide. They usually have 5 or more lanes. They are fast. They're usually signed at 30 or more miles per hour, and they have very limited pedestrian and bike infrastructure. So our infrastructure is failing communities of color and failing low-income communities in the US. And what we see as a result is when we look at race and bicyclist safety, we see that from 2015 to 2019, the per capita fatality rate for Black and Indigenous people on bikes was 25% higher and 75% higher respectively than it was for white bicyclists. And we can assume that some of this has to do with the lack of infrastructure that we're seeing in communities of color. So what about enforcement? How does that play out? There hasn't been a study on the enforcement of bicyclists in every city, but in the cities where studies have been done, the findings are remarkably similar. So I'm going to walk through a couple that we looked at for this resource. So there was a really in-depth resource done by the LA Times of race and bicyclist enforcement in LA County. They reviewed 44,000 bike stops made between 2017 and 2021. They found that 70% of these stops involved Latinx bicyclists, and bicyclists in lower income communities with large populations of people of color were stopped and searched more often than those in higher income, whiter neighborhoods. Another study on race and bicyclist enforcement in New York City found over the course of several years that Black and Latinx bicyclists received 75, 76, and 82% of all bike-related tickets in 2021, 2020, and 2019. These tickets were given for reasons such as reckless operation, biking in a park, and biking on the sidewalk. In Tampa, researchers found that there were 2,504 tickets issued to Tampa Bay bicyclists from 2012 to 2015. 80% of those were issued to Black people on bikes. And again, the violations included things like riding without a light, carrying somebody on the handlebars, rolling through a stop sign. And then finally, in Chicago, there was a study done that showed that people riding a bike in Black neighborhoods received twice as many tickets as those on a bike in white or Latinx communities. So what we did after we looked at those studies is we looked at what are the kinds of bike laws that are being enforced and that probably really shouldn't be because they're not doing anything to serve our safety goals. So the first is equipment, laws that enforce the kinds of equipment that bicyclists have on their bikes or on their bodies or registrations. The second is location, so where bicyclists are allowed to ride. And then the third is behavior, so how they're behaving on the street. And I want to spend a little bit of extra time on location because this is where this topic of infrastructure really comes in. So the location laws are things like biking on the sidewalk or biking on trails or biking the wrong way down a one-way street. These are often enforced to improve pedestrian safety, so they feel like laws that do make sense. But the truth is that they're almost always an indication that existing bike and pedestrian infrastructure is insufficient, it's inadequate, or it's just non-existent. So as a result, what we found is that infrastructure improvements, not enforcement, is a much more effective solution for improving the safety and comfort of the people who are exhibiting these behaviors on the streets. So let's go back to this when we talk about location-based infractions. Good bike infrastructure means safety, equity, and sustainability. Inadequate bike infrastructure doesn't mean these things, but it doesn't just not mean these things. It actually can mean increased enforcement. So in Chicago, remember I showed you the study out of Chicago that showed that more people in Black neighborhoods were being ticketed than in white neighborhoods. In one study, the existence of a bike lane on a major street cut the number of tickets in half compared to similar streets without bike lanes. And on arterials, this was even more stark. So bicyclists on arterial with a separated bike lane received 75% fewer tickets than those on arterials with no bike infrastructure. A similar kind of finding in Los Angeles out of that Los Angeles study was that 8% of bike stops across the county were for sidewalk violations. But in cities like Linwood within the county, sidewalk riding accounted for 16% of the stops, so many more stops, even though there are no bike lanes at all in the city of Linwood. And in nearby wealthier and whiter West Hollywood, which has many, many miles of bike lanes and a local code that actually allows bike riders to ride on the sidewalk when there's no bike lane there, fewer than 1% of the stops were made for sidewalk riding. And the reason that we see that kind of enforcement and the reason that we see that kind of inequitable enforcement is because when your average person walking down the street, and certainly your sort of average police officer, sees a person like this riding on the sidewalk, they think this is a person who's breaking the law. But what we're trying to do with our designs is to reframe this is a person whose needs are not being met. I mean, look at this street. This is not a street that a normal bicyclist would feel comfortable riding down. This is a bus lane, but look that it's really not occupied by buses. It's occupied by taxis. It's really busy. The sidewalk is nice and wide. This person obviously feels safer and more comfortable on the sidewalk than he does on the street. And this plays out when you look at research. So New York City has built tons of protected bike lanes across the city. New York City is also where I live. In 2010, the New York City Department of Transportation built the Prospect Park West bike lane, which is really close to where I live. And prior to that, nearly half of all bicyclists were riding on the sidewalk. So they were breaking the law. But when they implemented the new bike lane on the right, they found that sidewalk riding fell to less than 3%. And that's because people felt a lot safer biking on the sidewalk before there was a bike lane in place. And once there was a really nice protected bike lane in place, people were happy to move over to it. So that's kind of that on infrastructure. I'm happy to take questions about that. I'm going to really quickly run through the other two categories of laws that we looked at. Second is equipment, and these are things like bike registration laws, helmet laws, light laws, bells. They're often in place to, quote, protect bicyclists. Oftentimes they are buried very deep in state, county, and municipal codes. They can actually even sometimes discourage bicycling. And recently, a number of cities have been changing their equipment laws. Seattle removed their helmet law. Kansas City, Missouri changed a couple of laws after doing a really detailed look through their city code to find inequitable bicycling laws. I encourage you to read their report that they put out with, I think, the Safe Routes School Partnership, but Amy can correct me if that's wrong, and I can look for the link after this. And then finally, behavior laws. So these are laws like stop sign and red light running. And these are kind of an interesting category of law because they're sort of treating bikes like motor vehicles. So the intention here is to kind of try to ensure that the bicyclist behavior is predictable in the way that moving vehicle traffic behavior is predictable. But the truth is that bikes are not the same as cars. They're not the same as trucks. They're not the same as motor vehicles. And so ultimately, they're unlikely to provide meaningful safety gains. And there have been a lot of recent changes in the so-called Idaho stop law in different places. Colorado just this past year, 2022, passed a law allowing bicyclists to roll through, basically to treat stop signs as yield and to treat red lights as stop signs. So I'm going to conclude so that we have a few minutes for discussion. Thank you so much. And yeah, here's my email address.
Yeah, thank you all for those great presentations. Really appreciate the discussion, really appreciate the focus on safer infrastructure. I saw some great people chiming in the chat with things like people can no longer be ticketed for a bicycle registration violation in the state of California. We have 6 minutes left in this session, so I'm happy to ask a question, but I want to check to see if there are any questions in the room before I jump in there. So I see one in the back.
Just observation for the great presentation. I think that bike law actually did a study saying you were safer if you didn't stop at a stop sign than if you did on a bike, because if some idiot ran through the stop sign, you were still going and had enough momentum to get out of his way. So you might take a look at that bike law study.
Yeah, and I would also say the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has a fact sheet about the Idaho stop laws, or sometimes called stop as yield laws, kind of putting together what safety data we have around those laws as well, which we are seeing more and more states doing. So my question that I see from time to time from other traffic safety groups is that traffic fatalities are so high going up so much in recent years that we have to do something. And enforcement is that thing we can do right now as a measure. What is your response to that? How should we respond to that as advocates?
I can
Start?
Yeah, I can start, and then I'm sure other people can chime in. We hear that a lot too, and we actually hear it a lot in the crime fighting context. You hear the same trope about crime is up, we need to fight crime, stops are a way to get guns off the street. And I think that, my responses would be twofold. One is, it just doesn't work, right? It just doesn't, there's a lot, we've been studying high levels of enforcement a lot. There are studies of it in the traffic context that show some safety gains, but they tend to be pretty fleeting and they tend to be pretty low yield. And then we see some of it in the crime context, but again, minimal. And it's really hard to keep those levels of enforcement up. And then the trade-off is, well, what are they not doing? Right. And so there are only so many cops with only so many hours in the day. Departments are having a real challenging time staffing to full levels. If you're sending cops to do traffic enforcement that doesn't really move the needle on safety, you're taking them away from things where there's actually been demonstrated benefits. And then I'd also lay against that, what are all the harms, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to disrupt people's lives. Shanelle was telling us about the fines and fees and people getting arrested. Those are people who lose their jobs, who then, might be pushed toward doing like driving without a license, which can then be dangerous, right? Or they're choosing between, do I pay this fine or go to my court date or lose my job? And so if you're a community that's suffering from these problems, you're probably just going to compound them by throwing more enforcement at it.
Thank you for that answer. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? I think I also saw a question come in the chat. Is that true?
Yeah, I can say something to these questions are kind of related and they're related to yours, Ken. I think just to kind of add on to what Farhang is saying, the most effective way for I look at this from the city perspective, but in urban areas to focus traffic safety or traffic enforcement resources is specifically on the kinds of driving behaviors that are known to be the most dangerous. And so that's kind of the idea behind having enforcement as a component of a safe system approach, is that you have a really good understanding of what is causing your crashes. You have a really good understanding of what's causing your fatal and serious injury crashes, and you're deploying the resources that you have, including street design, policy change, and some enforcement to be able to specifically impact more with a scalpel than with any sort of more blunt force tool, the kinds of crashes that you're really facing in specific areas. So where we've seen, automated enforcement not be particularly successful is when it kind of goes and sits out on the street and it just sort of people rack up tickets, and there's no evaluation of whether or not, or like what's going on that street. So nobody's out there looking and seeing, wow, everybody is going 10 plus miles per hour over the speed limit. We probably have a major road redesign need here. Let's pull the traffic camera and focus there, or help that to sort of inform our prioritization. In places that have been more targeted with their automated enforcement or their traffic enforcement, it's more effective for supporting safety goals. So I think that's kind of the key in thinking about enforcement as part of a safe system approach, is that it should be in service of your broad safety goals, your sort of North Star safety goals, and it should be a complement to, rather than the entire strategy that's used to increase.
Yeah, thank you for that. We are at time right now, but I want to give time to Shanelle if she wants to weigh in here as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and respond quickly to a question that just came up in the chat about like, yes, infrastructure is ideal, but it takes time, it's hard. What do we do now? And just from our perspective at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, a couple of things that we try to encourage jurisdictions to do is one, to mitigate the harms. And that's through waivers and reductions of the fines and fees that are assessed. And also ability to pay assessment. So making sure that when fines and fees are assessed, that they are assessed in consideration of what an individual can pay without sacrificing their family's basic needs. So those are just a couple of things I just wanted to put out there.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know I definitely heard some interest in varied fines and fees, so that also higher income individuals who are less affected by fines are actually affected. Whereas we know they punish some people very severely who don't have those incomes. There are also those people like a Jeff Bezos who racked up a parking ticket, I think, for the entirety of the construction of his home in Washington, DC. And that's fine for him. So thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you to our great panelists. And thank you for all of your work and expertise.
Thanks, Ken.
Everybody.